presentation. I thought that was a good idea, because I really hadn't put together a lot of stuff about my career over the years. And as I started to put together, I said to Gail, my wife, who was here, you know, this sounds an awful lot like bragging. And I guess it really is, but when you consider the fact that they only train 1,500 pilots a year, I was traveling in pretty rarefied air back in those days. I was in the service from 64 to 68, and where am I going here? Here we are. And this is how I got into the program that I did. I went to Colby College, and they had in those days they had mandatory ROTC for the first 2 years. And I liked it enough that I stayed in the voluntary program. And by the way, if you guys have any questions as I go, you better ask them while they're fresh in your mind, because if you're like me, if I wait till the end of the presentation, you're gonna forget them. So I don't mind getting interrupted. I was commissioned second lieutenant in January of 1964, and I was commissioned by General Benjamin Davis, who at the time was the only black general in the United States Air Force. We had a nice chat. He stayed for about 15 minutes, and his son followed in his footsteps. His son is also a general at this point. I entered undergraduate pilot training. I was in the class of 64 XF. The X standard for experimental. Normally the pilot training class was 12 to 13 months, and they pushed it down to 9 to 10 because of the Vietnam War coming on. But they did pay for our private pilot's license while I was at Colby, so they gave you some flying experience before you even got into the pilot training. After pilot training, I was assigned to the 41st Air Transport Squadron and went into C-130 training. I wanted the C-130. I finished in the top of my class in pilot training, and that entitled me to pick whatever aircraft I wanted. I loved the C-130. It was just a terrific airplane, and it had a worldwide mission capability. Come on. Come on. Might be easy to do that. There we go. Whoops.
Yeah, these are signs.
I also brought my, there we are. The undergraduate training was done at Laughlin Air Force Base, in Del Rio, Texas, which is, I can tell you, not a very nice place to be. It was way out in the sticks, right on the Mexican border, but it had good weather down there. The T-37 was a terrific airplane. It was small. The top speed was around 450, completely aerobatic, and we generally soloed in 8 to 10 hours. You'd come in one day, you'd land the plane, and the instructor says, "Okay, Kimball, this is it. You're on your own." He'd get out of the plane, and I had to make 3 successive landings and takeoffs to prove that I could do it, which I did. It was completely aerobatic, and one of the nice things about the T-37 was that it was certified to spin. Not all planes are like that. And you get into a spin by simply pulling the nose up, releasing off the airspeed. If you want to spin to the right, you mash the right rudder, and it would go into a spin like this, and you'd be dropping pretty quickly. The fun part of it was you could also put that plane into an inverted spin. So you just push the stick straight towards the dashboard, and the plane would flip upside down, and you're turning the way you were before. To get out, you just pull the stick back, it would turn over and you'd get the airspeed under control and fly off. It scared the hell out of me the first time we did it, I gotta tell you that.
Scared me.
Formation flying was terrific, and instrument flying, and of the 4 items, I really enjoyed the aerobatics and the instrument flying. Halfway through, we went into advanced pilot training in the T-33, which you can see is a substantially larger aircraft than I was flying before. This is an offshoot of the F-80 that was used in the Korean War. They added a second cockpit for the instructor pilot, and then, or second seat, I guess I would say. And because that interrupted where the location of the fuel tank was, they added tip tanks to the plane, and that gets to be very important when you're doing aerobatics. We had a similar agenda, soloed after 8 or 10 hours, aerobatics, formation flying, cross-country navigation, and night flying. Night flying was interesting because you couldn't see a thing, obviously. And on a night flying cross-country, you had to plan out your route, take off and go to a certain destination. And you could see the lights of the towns that you had to go by, but the night we flew, it was an overcast above us, so there was no moon. And you could follow the guy in front of you who you could probably see. He was probably 5 miles in front of you. But then if he was lost, then you were lost. That's the problem. But I made it there, landed, and I was so happy to be on the ground that I mashed on the brakes and turned off at the first taxiway. I walked into the squadron very proud of myself that I had made it, and I got reamed out. Hey, Kimball, what the hell? You were supposed to go to the end of the runway with shorter brake pads on these T-33s, and you screwed up. And I wasn't too happy after that. So once we got done with this, I was able to select the 130 for a aircraft. And while I was down in the T-33 program, Gail came down, and the squadron commander took her around the base and showed her what was going on. And she could watch me go out and pre-flight the plane and everything. And he parked his car right behind the T-33. Not right behind, but probably 100 feet away. Because he knew, but Gail didn't. When you started the T-33, you put the ignition on after it rotated up to about 30 RPM, 30%. And then you flicked another switch which dumped a bunch of fuel into the engine. Back in those days, we didn't have this precise metering to spray fuel in to do it right. The fuel would light up and there'd be a flame about 3 feet long that would come out the back of the aircraft. And of course, Gail's sitting back there, and I think she said to herself, I better get this guy before he blows himself up. And I did ask her to marry me after a couple of nights after that. And between pilot training and the C-130, I came home to Worcester, and we got married, and we jumped into the car and came down to Charleston. C-130, as you can see, is quite a large aircraft. It's a 100-foot wingspan. It's got 4,000 horsepower per engine on there. It can do just about anything you want it to do. They even had an aerobatic team for the 130. And the new model, the J model, which they're still building, can loop. He did it at the Paris Air Show. I put this in here only to give you some perspective on the size of the aircraft. obviously that's a mechanic checking the engine, but those big fat propeller blades were key to the success of the 130, because it would move a lot of air, and particularly when you're doing short field landings, and you reverse the prop, that airflow really slowed that plane down quickly. One of the things we trained for was dropping paratroopers. And Dick, did you tell me you jumped out of a 130 at one point?
At the end of my career, I did.
Did you? Okay. Of course, the pilots are sitting there saying, I don't know what these guys want to do jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. But they did, and obviously Dick was successful at it. We also dropped cargo wherever we needed to, and trained well for that. We also had to do assault landings, particularly in Vietnam. When you were coming in, you wanted to stay high because of small arms fire from the ground. So you stayed up at about 2,000 or 2,500 feet. And then as the runway came under the nose of the aircraft, you'd point the nose down. If we had passengers going on, we would warn them, but they still couldn't appreciate what was gonna happen. When we, from a pilot's viewpoint, when we pointed that nose down, all you could see was ground filling the windscreen. The pilot's calling off the altitude because the co-pilot, the pilots oftentimes would get fixated on the ground. They also call it target fixation. So the co-pilot was calling off altitude so we could pull out in time. Okay, now this plane, the 130 up in the top right, you see coming along. He's flying level. And all of a sudden, he's gonna just drop that nose. There he goes.
Oh, geez.
So if you were sitting towards the back of the airplane, you got quite a swing. And so you get down to about 600 feet and start to level out. And this is an air show in Smyrna, Georgia. And
Wow.
you see it in a minute. The Blue Angels were there. At that point, we put the engine in the reverse, or the props in the reverse, jump on the brakes. He didn't do it here, but we could land that plane at 1,500 to 2,000 feet, depending upon how much weight we were carrying.
How many men were on there?
5. 2 pilots, navigator, flight engineer, and a loadmaster. Down at the bottom is a C-130 that's landed on dirt, which we did quite frequently. And the dirt and the dust would catch up to the plane as the plane, and then it emerges from the dust like a ghost coming out.
Wow.
We also used a system called LAPES, which is Low Altitude Parachute Extraction System. We'd fly towards the runway, the navigator would be controlling it, and we'd be flying the plane at 20 to 30 feet off the ground. And you notice we have the wheels down just in case we didn't keep it up there. The navigator would signal the loadmaster when to release the load. Drogue chute would come out, pull the main parachutes out, and it would pull the pallets out with it. Land on the runway, would fly off, and this pallet would continue skidding down the runway. One of the things about it was, as soon as that pallet left the plane jumped up about 50 feet, because there was quite a bit of weight on that plane that was just exited in like 2 seconds. I didn't have to do this much in Vietnam, probably a couple of times at most. We also were trained to use the JATO, which is Jet Assisted Takeoff. I only did it once in practice, never had to use it again. but I'm gonna show you a video shortly, which I think you've seen, John, that will show you excessive use of the JADO. All right, you remember the Iranian hostage situation? In one of the efforts to rescue them, and I was not involved in this, thank goodness, was to equip one C-130. They wanted to land it inside the soccer stadium in Tehran. And it's not a lot of room. So they came up with this cockamamie idea of putting a JADO bottles all over the 130 to cushion it when it landed, to stop its forward momentum and so forth. And there's gonna be a couple iterations of this as we go. But they also had it set up to use more JADOs to take off and be sure they got off in that short space. See, they've added one in the back, and there are two almost under the wings. This will show you the ground firing the rockets towards the ground to cushion it down. This is part of the test. And this was successful, but it didn't stop it short enough. So rather than leave well enough alone, they added some more rockets right up just behind the cockpit windows. You can see a little protrusion on the skin of the aircraft. So this is the real test. There go the rockets there. The problem is, when all that stuff went off, it blinded the pilots, and they couldn't see how high above the runway they were, and that just shows it taking off again. But okay, this is the real one here. The top ones have lit off.
Oh my God.
There go the side ones. And now it's obscured in smoke and dirt and dust and everything else. Now watch when it emerges.
Holy shit.
Look to your left, see the wing fall off? The engine is still running. And the plane's turning to spinning on its axis right there, because it's probably because it's dragging the wing. The engines are still running on the other side. Fortunately, the crew door is on the right-hand side of the airplane in this photo, and every single crew member made it out of that plane uninjured. I just can't get over it. I've seen this video so many times.
Did you get hazardous duty pay for this?
Pardon me?
Did you get hazardous duty pay for this?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, yeah. Just light skin.
Now you know why we jumped out of them.
You're right.
Perfectly good airplane.
For a while it was.
Look at that, oh my God.
We also preached staying ahead of the aircraft. This is me. I hope I'm reading information about the airport I'm going to and not reading Playboy. But on long flights with all the stuff we needed to know about where we were going.
You sure that's you? He's got hair.
Huh?
He's got hair.
Yeah, that's right. Every once in a while, I'd help the navigator, who could be quite busy, and I'd take the sunshot for him so that he could pencil it in and be sure that he knew where we were. One of the things that I used to do, and the navigator never knew about it, was that I would, let's say we're going from Travis in California to Hawaii, when we got within what I estimated to be 5 or 6 of the miles of Hawaii, I would tune the ADF, which is Automatic Direction Finder, which used the AM radio band. I would tune that and find a radio station on Hawaii. And hopefully that needle was pointed at the top of the aircraft. If it wasn't, we ain't gonna make that island. So, but it was always up there, and the navigator never knew I was cheating on him. Every once in a while, we get called up to the wing commander's office for something we did good. And they made a little bit of a show of it. The photographers came in and so forth. And I think I got called up twice for action I took out in the field. It didn't increase my paycheck, however.
Second from the right.
Some of the most interesting missions I had were these. Nord Island is a little island on the tip of Greenland, which was a Danish weather station, theoretically. But I've never seen a weather station that had all these parabolic big dish antennas. And they're all over the place. And I include Nord Island just to illustrate how an aircraft commander has sole authority to do what he wants to do on the plane, and nobody could or should question it. So we made 2 or 3 trips up, and Nord Island, Greenland is a really big island. It took us a couple hours to fly from the southern tip to the island. About the 3rd trip, I think it was, we got up there, we knew it was snowing, we knew it was solid overcast. It had a non-precision approach aid, and the minimum on that was 800 feet. The ceiling at the time was 600 feet, so technically I shouldn't go in. So I held at the top, up above the overcast, for maybe half an hour, and in order to land there, they would, and if there was snow on the runway, they would have a barrel on the back of a pickup truck, and they would run a red line down the center of the runway, or hopefully it's the center of the runway. And it was about a 4,000 foot runway, which is short for the 130. And finally I decided that I'm not gonna do that, because A, I would break minimums. 2, if I went off the runway for some reason, they'd have a hell of a time getting that airplane back on the runway. They'd have to fly in a bulldozer and all this other stuff. And so I didn't. And I got back to the ops officer in Thule and walked in, and he said, "Ed Kimball, why didn't you go in?" I said, "Below minimums." That's the only thing I heard about the fact that I didn't go in. If there had been an accident and they had an accident board convened, the first thing they would want to know is, what's the weather? And secondly, what are the minimums? Oh, he broke minimums, case closed, pilot error, my flying career is over. We would also go to Châteauroux, France on a 30D TDY. And by the way, my hat's off to the wives, including mine, because this kind of flying is really tough on them, because we were gone all the time. I think in the first 5 years of marriage, I bet you I was gone 60 to 70% of the time. If I made 2 trips to Vietnam during the month, I'd be home for a total of 6 days. So it was tough on them, particularly if they had children, and we had one child at that point. He's sitting right there, he's now got gray hair.
Lucky to have hair.
So, my hat's off to them. That also factored in with what I did after the service, so. In Châteauroux, we would travel up to the Nordic countries, across to Iran. I've got furniture in our house from Tehran. In Pakistan, where you go up to a place called Peshawar, which is up near the Khyber Pass, and drop supplies out there, and that supposedly also was another weather station, but they flew B-57Gs out of there, which was a predecessor of the U-2, and it wasn't to do weather research, I can assure you.
Raises power.
Also down into Africa, and some of the places that we stayed overnight were atrocious, Africa included. When I landed at Addis Ababa, 4-lane highway out of the airport, flags flying, everything else. You get a mile outside the airport, the 4-lane road ends, turns to dirt, and there you go. The Gemini 9 capsule I carried from Naval Station South Weymouth, and what it was doing there, I have no idea. But you just can't understand unless you've seen it how small that capsule is that carried 2 guys up to space. And it was burned and charred and showing the real effects of coming down through the stratosphere and the atmosphere. But we've carried that out to McDonnell Douglas plant in somewhere in the Midwest, I don't recall. And they're gonna refurbish it and I guess use it again. We also had a mission down to South America, which took us to the various missile stations along the way. And we would, the first day we would wind up in Recife, Brazil, and stay at this god-awful rooming house in Recife. The plumbing didn't work half the time, and it was noisy. The unfortunate part, on that trip, you had to stay there twice. Because the next morning, we would fly out to Ascension Island to resupply there, and then come back to Recife, and we'd run out of crew duty time and have to stay again.
I was at Recife too.
Were you?
Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't stay in the same rooming house I did, I don't think. When we went out to Assumption, it was a pleasant flight, but the runway at Ascension is not flat. It rises up in the beginning and then you go over a hump and down the other side. I don't know whether that was geology that caused that to be that way, but that's what we had to deal with. And then the last one, Vietnam, not particularly interesting, and that would be the wrong terminology for it. Interesting flying, yes, but some of the stuff that I saw and had to deal with, I wouldn't, put it on anybody. When we were flying to Vietnam, we flew on what we call the stage. So I would leave Charleston and McGuire, go to someplace in the U.S. and pick up a load, refuel, and go to Travis. We would come pick up the plane, we'd come into Travis, go to 12 hours crew rest. 2 hours later, that plane would be off again with a new crew. The plane would make it around the whole circle, one-way circle, because there was so much traffic, in 4 or 5 days. It would take the pilots and the crew 10 to 12 days to get back. Because from Travis, we would go to Hawaii, then from Hawaii to Guam or Wake or Midway Island, from there into the Philippines, which is why I gave you this. And from the Philippines, we go into any place they wanted us to, and wherever the load was destined in South Vietnam, including Thailand, but we couldn't fly over Laos or Cambodia. This shows you where all the airports are and so forth in Vietnam, and just to highlight a couple, the furthest north I went, this is the DMZ right here. Dong Ha and Khe Sanh, both of which were forward operating bases. You probably never heard of Dong Ha, but I know you've heard of Khe Sanh. They both have runways of about 3,500 feet. The longest runway we had was down here in Cam Ranh Bay, which is the main port of entry for cargo coming into Vietnam. Ships would offload around there, come to Cam Ranh, they'd be put on planes to go somewhere in Vietnam. When I started flying into Cam Ranh Bay, we were landing on PSP, which is pierced steel planking, which is steel planking that's got holes in it. That they put it down, it lets the dirt settle up into the hole and keeps it relatively stable. When you land, you'd see that stuff ripple out in front of you. And every so often, they'd have to go down to the end of the runway, pick up a couple of those planks and pull them back and put them on the end so they keep the runway in the same place. When I stopped flying into Vietnam, Cam Ranh Bay was the equivalent of Logan Airport. I've never in my life seen so much cement poured in such a short time that I did at Cam Ranh. It was really wild. I've got a couple of shots here of aircraft, the airports that we flew into. This is Khe Sanh. This is about a 3,500-foot runway. And a lot of people don't realize it, but Vietnam is very, very mountainous. The only flat parts are right around the coast where the beaches are. So we normally had to come in over these mountains right here, and that entails all kinds of stuff like turbulent wind and so forth. Vietnam also had some atrocious thunderstorms, particularly during the monsoon season. And we've come into Khe Sanh, and in the early days of Khe Sanh, they only had the one runway. They had no turnoffs or anything else. So you'd come in and offload at the far end of the runway, and then we had to back the plane up the entire length of the runway, which you did by simply reversing the props, and then we take off again. I put that arrow in there because if you don't know where to look, it's very difficult to see that runway. And this was taken from about 3,000 feet. This is the worst runway in Vietnam, I think. It's called Ba Loc. And that's less than half the runway right there. The other half is over the edge, right here. And it went down quite steeply, and you'd land, you couldn't see the far end of the runway. And if you were standing up here, all of a sudden you'd see the tip of the tail start to come up over the edge of the runway there, and then you'd see the nose, and then the whole plane would come into view. In 1968, I got a chance to, 1998, I got a chance to fly the simulator of the 130 again, after I'd been out of the service for some number of years. My friend who I flew with in the service stayed in, and he was the control of the C-130 simulator at the Minnesota Air National Guard base. And so we had it on a Friday afternoon the whole time. And those simulators are so accurate that when you were taxiing out, you could feel the bump on the cement. And it was also on about 8 legs. So if you put it into a 30-degree bank, hydraulically it would shift the simulator to be a 30-degree bank. You would never stable. Up here are the T-handles that we would pull if we lost an engine, or more frequently the gearbox on the engine, on the propeller, between the propeller and the engine, would fail, and we'd have to shut the engine down because there was no way of disconnecting it. The other reason we would have to shut an engine down is if the generator failed. For some reason, they did not put a disconnect between the engine and the generator. The generator is driven by the engine. So if that failed, you couldn't leave it that way because the generator would overheat and then spray parts all over the engine. So you had to shut the engine down. iterations, the 130, they had a gunship, which I'm sure you've all seen pictures of. Command and control, where they load a module into the 130 and they go up around 20,000 feet or so that the managers of what's going on at the time could control the whole operation from the C-130. It's also been adapted for firefighting, and you've probably seen photos in the last few days of 130s dropping flame retardant and so forth on the fire in Los Angeles. It's key equipment for resupplying Antarctica, and also search and rescue operations. And one of the interesting things of the rescue operation was that they had a procedure where if somebody wanted to be a rescue and they had the equipment, that a balloon would take a long line up. It's like bungee jumping in reverse. The C-130 would come along, it had a fork on the front, it would grab that line and it would stream back, and the loadmaster would then pull the guy in the other end of it into the back end of the plane and then fly off. And finally, I don't believe this is gonna happen, but there's a proposal on the board to put pontoons on a 130 for use in the Pacific, for going to all the small islands in case we get involved in China. And, you know, the 130 with the load weighs 165,000 pounds. I don't see how you can put pontoons on there big enough to do it, but like the Iranian operation, you know, some generals say we ought to try this, and off we go. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Wow, very good.
Anybody have any- I gotta tell you, it's the greatest experience I ever had in my life, except the one I got married.
I didn't know he was gonna say that.
It was just,
I did.
just a wonderful time, great guys to work with, and we did things in the aircraft that when I was 24 years old, that at 84 I wouldn't even think of doing. It was just, well, you guys know the feeling. It was just a great experience, that's all I can say. So, there you go.
Good job.
Good job.